Three Demon's Path bikers swaggered onto Hampton Harbor's main pier, looking for protection money. They found a Marine Force Recon veteran mending his fishing nets instead. What followed would expose a billion-dollar drug smuggling operation, teach New England's most feared motorcycle gang a brutal lesson, and reveal a web of corruption stretching from local police to international traffickers. Sometimes the most dangerous person on the waterfront is the quiet fisherman checking his crab traps at dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled across Hampton Harbor as Michael Sullivan methodically inspected his fishing nets, his weathered hands moving with the precision earned from both military service and decades at sea. The silver star pin on his old Navy pea coat caught the first rays of sunlight, a quiet reminder of battles fought long ago. At 68, Sullivan still maintained the situational awareness that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Vietnam. Sarah Chen, who ran the harbor's main fish market for the past decade, emerged from her shop with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She'd transformed the once struggling market into a thriving community hub where local fishermen and tourists alike found fresh catch and friendly faces. "Your usual, Mike?" Sarah called out, already walking down the weathered planks toward his boat, the Sea Ghost. "You know me too well," Sullivan replied, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. The peaceful harbor scene shattered as 3 motorcycles roared down the pier, their engines drowning out the crying seagulls. The bikes stopped in a practiced formation, blocking access to several fishing vessels. Their riders, wearing black leather jackets emblazoned with a demon's head patch, dismounted with practiced arrogance. Marcus Razor Reed, his neck covered in elaborate tattoos, removed his helmet and surveyed the harbor like a predator sizing up prey. His companions, Chris Tank Thompson and Victor the Russian Petrov, spread out along the pier. "Well, well," Razor announced, his voice carrying across the water. "Looks like we found ourselves a real piece of maritime history, like something out of an old fisherman's tale." Sullivan continued mending his nets, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Sarah tensed but maintained her professional demeanor. "Welcome to Hampton Harbor," she said evenly. "What brings you to our pier?" Razor's laugh held no warmth. "Oh, how quaint. A proper greeting and everything, like stepping back in time." Tank and the Russian began walking the pier, their boots heavy on the wooden planks as they studied the boats with predatory interest. "Hey, old-timer," Razor called out, sauntering closer to Sullivan. "Nice boat. Bet she's seen better days." "67 Nova Scotia build," Sullivan replied calmly. "Still runs perfectly." "Might look better under new ownership," Razor suggested, running a hand along the Sea Ghost's rail. Sullivan turned slowly, facing Razor directly for the first time. Something in his eyes made the younger man pause, though he quickly covered it with a smirk. "Son," Sullivan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've seen your kind before. You think those patches and leather make you dangerous, but you're just playing at being bad men." Razor's smirk twisted into a snarl. "Watch your mouth, old man. This is a dangerous place to disrespect the Demon's Path." "I've fought alongside real dangerous men in Vietnam," Sullivan continued, his voice steady. "Men who'd make you wet yourself just by looking at you. Last warning, take your business elsewhere." Tank pulled out a butterfly knife, flicking it open with practiced flair. "Maybe we should teach Gramps here some respect." What none of them noticed was Sarah quietly pressing a panic button under her market counter, or the small camera above her door recording everything, its red light blinking steadily. "Put it away," Sullivan said, not even glancing at the knife, "before you embarrass yourself." The morning fog continued to roll across the harbor, shrouding the coming confrontation in an almost mythic haze. None of them could have guessed how this simple standoff would expose a criminal empire that stretched from the New England coast to the South China Sea, or how one old fisherman's stand would give hope to an entire waterfront community living in fear. The early morning standoff at Hampton Harbor drew unexpected attention. Even before the harbor master Tom Chen arrived for his morning rounds, 3 police cruisers pulled into the lot, their lights flashing silently through the fog. Sarah watched from her market window as Officer Reynolds stepped out, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Everything all right here?" Reynolds called out, but his eyes darted nervously between Sullivan and the bikers. Something in his stance seemed off, too rehearsed. Sullivan noticed it too. 20 years in Force Recon had taught him to read body language like a book. Reynolds wasn't responding to a disturbance call. He was expecting this confrontation. "Just a friendly conversation," Razor said, suddenly all smiles and compliance. "Right, old-timer?" Sullivan kept his position by the Sea Ghost's rail, watching Reynolds carefully. "If you say so." Tom Chen emerged from the harbor office, tablet in hand. At 45, he ran the harbor with the efficiency he'd learned during his years in the Coast Guard. "Mike, your slip fee's due next week," he announced, deliberately casual, but his eyes conveyed a different message. The Russian whispered something to Razor, who nodded slowly. "Well, looks like our welcome's worn out. We'll be seeing you around, old man." As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Sullivan caught a glimpse of something unusual. Military-grade radio equipment mounted discreetly on one of the bikes. Not the kind of gear ordinary gang members would carry. Once the bikers roared away, Reynolds approached Sullivan. "You should be careful, Mr. Sullivan. Demon's Path isn't known for their forgiveness." "Funny thing about forgiveness," Sullivan replied. "Works better when everyone's playing straight, like cops doing their actual job instead of running interference for gangs." Reynolds' face tightened. "That sounds like an accusation." "Just an observation, from someone who's seen this dance before." After Reynolds left, Tom and Sarah joined Sullivan on his boat. "Those weren't ordinary gang members," Tom said quietly, showing Sullivan his tablet. He'd captured high-resolution photos of the bikes, including close-ups of the radio gear. "No," Sullivan agreed. "That's maritime band equipment, military grade. Same kind drug runners use to coordinate with ships offshore." Sarah looked worried. "They've been showing up more lately, watching the harbor, asking questions about shipping schedules." "They're mapping the harbor," Sullivan explained. "Learning patterns, checking security. It's what I would have done back in Vietnam before a coastal insertion." "The police response was too quick," Tom noted. "Almost like they were waiting nearby." Sullivan nodded. "Reynolds is on their payroll. Probably others too. They've got people watching the harbor, coordinating with someone offshore." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. "For now, nothing obvious, but Tom, those cameras you installed last month, they're still recording?" 24/7 coverage, uploads to a secure cloud server, part of the new harbor security system. "Good. Keep them running." "And Sarah, that panic button you pressed, where does that alert go?" "Harbor Security Office and local police." "Add one more destination," Sullivan said. "I've got an old friend in the DEA. Time to let him know something's happening in Hampton Harbor." The fog was starting to lift, revealing more boats heading out for the day's catch. But Sullivan's trained eye caught something else. A sleek cigarette boat anchored just at the horizon line. Too far for casual observation, but perfect for coordinating offshore activities. "They'll be back," Sullivan said. "Men like that, they're used to taking what they want. My refusal just made their job more complicated." "You could have just paid them off," Sarah suggested. "Most of the other businesses do." "That's what they're counting on, fear and compliance. But sometimes you have to make a stand, even if it means stirring up trouble." Tom checked his radio. "Harbor Patrol reports that cigarette boat's been out there 3 days now. Claims to be a pleasure craft." "In this weather? In March?" Sullivan shook his head. "They're setting up something big, using the gang for muscle, corrupt cops for cover, and the harbor for whatever they're bringing in." The morning continued, deceptively normal. Fishing boats came and went, tourists wandered the pier, and Sarah's market did its usual business. But something had changed. A line had been drawn, a challenge made. And Michael Sullivan, who'd spent his military career tracking coastal smuggling operations, recognized the signs of an approaching storm. The evening brought an unsettling quiet to Hampton Harbor. Sullivan sat in his boat's cabin, studying the harbor's shipping schedules, when 3 more Demon's Path bikes rolled onto the pier, accompanied by 2 black SUVs. This time they moved with military precision, positioning themselves to control all access points. Razor dismounted first, flanked by 6 men Sullivan didn't recognize. Their leather jackets bore the same demon head patch, but their stance and movement screamed professional training. "Miss us, old man?" Razor called out. "Brought some friends who wanted to meet the stubborn fisherman." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sullivan emerged from his cabin, noting the positions of each man. They'd spread out in a standard defensive formation, covering angles of fire. Not gang tactics, military training. One of the SUV's doors opened, and a tall figure stepped out. James "Ghost" Wilson, his face marked by a distinctive scar, approached the Sea Ghost. Sullivan recognized the walk. Force Recon, just like him. "Michael Sullivan," Ghost said, his voice gravelly from old wounds. "Been a long time. Fallujah, 2004. You were running coastal interdiction while I was hunting insurgents." "Ghost Wilson," Sullivan replied. "Last I heard, you were training counter-terrorism units. Quite a career change." Sarah watched nervously from her market as more bikers arrived, establishing a perimeter around the pier. Tom Chen stood in his office doorway, quietly recording everything on his phone. "Life changes," Ghost shrugged. "Found better opportunities in the private sector. Speaking of opportunities, we need to discuss your position here at Hampton Harbor." "Nothing to discuss. This is a working harbor, not a smuggling operation." Ghost's scarred face twisted into something resembling a smile. "Always direct, weren't you? That's what made you effective in Vietnam. But times change, old man. The harbor's changing too." Sullivan noticed movement on the cigarette boat offshore. Men with rifles, watching through scopes. "Using veterans as muscle now, Ghost? That what you came to?" "We're creating opportunities," Ghost replied. "For men the system abandoned. Men with skills. The demon's path provides structure, purpose, good money. By running drugs? Trafficking weapons? That's not purpose. That's betrayal of everything we fought for." The Russian whispered something to Razor, who nodded and spoke into his radio. More bikes appeared at the harbor entrance. "Last chance, Sullivan," Ghost said. "The harbor's important to our operation. Strategic location, regular traffic, perfect cover for moving product. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Like you made it hard in 04. Sullivan's words hit home. "When you started selling intel to the highest bidder?" Ghost's face darkened. "Careful, old man. You don't know what you're dealing with." "Actually, I do. Same pattern as Vietnam, using fishing boats to move contraband, corrupt officials for cover, and now veterans as muscle. Only difference is the scale." Sarah had edged closer to her panic button, but Ghost's men had noticed. "I wouldn't," Ghost warned. "Those cameras you installed? They're being handled." But Sullivan smiled slightly. "You sure about that, Ghost? You're not the only one with friends in interesting places. DEA's been watching that cigarette boat for days now." The tension ratcheted up as Ghost processed this information. His hand twitched toward his jacket, but Sullivan's steady gaze stopped him. "We're not done here," Ghost growled, backing toward his SUV. "Tell your DEA friends that Hampton Harbor is off limits. This is our territory now." As the gang retreated, Sullivan noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Tactical hand signals, coordinated movement, professional radio discipline. These weren't just bikers. They were trained operators working for someone with serious resources. Tom approached once the last bike roared away. "That was intense. You really know him?" "Knew him," Sullivan corrected. "Before he went rogue. Now he's running operations for someone bigger, someone with enough pull to recruit ex-military, corrupt local police, and set up sophisticated smuggling networks." "They'll be back," Sarah said, bringing coffee to calm her nerves. "Counting on it," Sullivan replied. "But next time we'll be ready. Tom, send those recordings to my old contact at the DEA. And Sarah might want to close early tonight. Something tells me Hampton Harbor is about to get very interesting." The sunset painted the water in shades of red, but Sullivan's mind was already working through scenarios, patterns, remembering old lessons from coastal operations in Vietnam. Ghost's presence changed everything. This wasn't just about local gang activity anymore. It was about something much bigger. And somewhere out on that water, plans were being made that would turn this quiet harbor into a battleground. The next morning brought DEA agent David Carter to Hampton Harbor, his weathered face a testament to decades chasing maritime smugglers. Sullivan recognized the careful way he scanned the waterfront, old habits from their shared time in Vietnam. "Mike," Carter nodded, joining Sullivan on the Sea Ghost. "Got your message. Those cameras caught some interesting faces. Ghost Wilson's been on our radar since he started recruiting veterans for private security work." "He's running more than security," Sullivan replied, spreading out harbor maps on his deck. "Look at these shipping patterns. Past 3 months, increased traffic at odd hours, boats running dark, that cigarette boat maintaining station offshore." Carter studied the patterns. Classic signs, using fishing vessels for pickup, regular boats for cover, just like in Nam. "There's more," Tom Chen approached, carrying his tablet. "Those bikers? They're watching specific berths, tracking certain boats. I've mapped their surveillance patterns." The tablet showed a detailed grid of the harbor, with time-stamped locations of Demon's Path activity. Clear patterns emerged. They were focusing on boats that made regular runs to international waters. "Professional work," Carter noted. "Military precision. Ghosts trained them well." Sarah emerged from her market, carrying coffee and news. 3 more fishing boats got approached last night, offered protection and extra income for special deliveries. "They're expanding their network," Sullivan explained, "building a web of compromised vessels, same technique drug cartels use in the Gulf." A police cruiser rolled by, Officer Reynolds again watching them with poorly concealed interest. "Local law enforcement's compromised," Carter said quietly. "We've suspected for months, but couldn't prove it. Your cameras might change that." Sullivan pointed to specific spots on the harbor map. "They're using traditional fishing routes to mask their movements. But look here, and here. Dead zones in the radar coverage. Perfect for transferring cargo." "Like the patterns we tracked in the Mekong," Carter remembered, "using local knowledge against us." Tom showed them more footage. "These new Demon's Path members, they move differently. Watch their formations, their communications." The video revealed military-style hand signals, coordinated movements, professional radio discipline. "Ghost is recruiting veterans who know maritime operations," Sullivan concluded. "Men with coastal warfare experience, building a specialized unit disguised as a biker gang." "Question is, why here?" Sarah asked. "Why Hampton Harbor?" "Location," Carter explained. "Deep water access, regular commercial traffic, easy routes to international waters. Perfect smuggling setup." Sullivan noticed something on Tom's surveillance feeds. The cigarette boat was moving, making a precise course adjustment. "They're waiting for something," he said. "Ghost's operation is too sophisticated for simple drug running. This is bigger." "Much bigger," Carter agreed. "We've tracked similar patterns up and down the coast. Veterans being recruited, harbors infiltrated, local authorities compromised. Someone's building an infrastructure." A group of tourists walked by, snapping photos. Among them, Sullivan spotted 2 men paying too much attention to the harbor's security cameras. "We're being watched," he said quietly. "Ghost people are mapping our response." "Let them," Carter replied. "Sometimes the best way to catch smugglers is to let them think they're smarter than you." Sarah looked worried. "What's our next move?" "We wait," Sullivan said. "Ghost will make his play soon. Men like him, they can't help themselves. Pride makes them predictable." Carter checked his phone. "Got a team setting up surveillance on that cigarette boat. Whatever they're waiting for, we'll be ready." The morning continued, deceptively normal. But beneath the surface, plans were being made, pieces moving into position. Ghost's operation was about to reveal itself, and Hampton Harbor would become ground zero in a war that had been brewing since Vietnam. Sullivan touched the silver star pin on his peacoat, remembering other harbors, other battles. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't finding the enemy. It was waiting for them to show their hand. The afternoon brought a flurry of activity to Hampton Harbor. Sullivan watched from his boat as 3 large fishing vessels arrived simultaneously, 2 coordinated to be coincidence. Ghost's operation was making its first major move. "Multiple contacts," Tom radioed from the harbor office. 6 more boats approaching from the east, not responding to identification requests. Sullivan studied them through his binoculars. Commercial fishing tags, but their gear's wrong. Those are smuggling vessels disguised as trawlers. Carter's DEA surveillance team tracked the incoming boats while maintaining their cover as tourist photographers. Getting movement from that cigarette boat, too. They're coordinating something big. Demon's path bikers began arriving in groups, taking up positions around the harbor. Their formations were different now, tactical arrangements providing overlapping fields of control. "They're securing the harbor," Sullivan noted. "Standard protocol for a major operation. Ghost is running this like a military landing zone." Sarah's market had become their impromptu observation post. "More corrupt cops showing up," she reported. "Reynolds has 4 cruisers blocking harbor access roads." The cigarette boat suddenly accelerated, making a precise course toward the incoming vessels. Ghost emerged from one of the black SUVs, directing his men with military hand signals. This isn't just about drugs, Sullivan realized, watching the pattern emerge. Look at those boats' draft lines. They're riding too high. Empty cargo holds waiting to be filled. "Weapons," Carter concluded. "They're using the harbor as a transfer point, bringing in arms shipments disguised as fishing catches." Tom's surveillance cameras caught Ghost coordinating with the corrupt officers, establishing security perimeters. "They've got the whole harbor locked down. Anyone who's not part of their operation is being turned away." Sullivan noticed something else. Specific fishing boats being moved to create a screen around certain berths. "They're setting up a hidden loading zone. Classic technique we used in Vietnam for covert supply operations." "Mike," Sarah called urgently. "Some of Ghost's men are heading for your boat." 3 Demon's Path members approached the Sea Ghost, led by the Russian. "Time to move, old man. This section of the harbor is closed for maintenance." "My boat stays where it is," Sullivan replied calmly. "Coast Guard regulations. Can't move during active fishing operations." The Russian's face darkened. "This isn't a request. Ghost wants this area clear. Now." What they didn't notice was Sullivan's subtle hand signal to Carter, or the DEA teams quietly moving into position around the harbor. "Interesting operation you're running," Sullivan said, keeping their attention. "Military-grade equipment, coordinated boat movements, professional security. Must have taken months to set up." "Last warning," the Russian growled. "Move your boat, or we'll move it for you." "Like you moved those weapons shipments through other harbors?" Sullivan asked quietly. "How many ports have you compromised? How many veterans have you corrupted?" The Russian's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sullivan was already in motion. Years of combat training took over as he disarmed the younger man with brutal efficiency. "Signal your men to back off," Sullivan ordered, the Russian's own knife now at his throat. Quietly. From the harbor office, Tom recorded everything. The cameras caught Ghost's reaction. Not surprise, but cold calculation. He spoke rapidly into his radio, and suddenly the harbor erupted into chaos. The incoming boats accelerated, their innocent facade abandoned. Demon's Path members drew weapons, but they weren't the only ones ready for action. "Federal agents!" Carter's voice boomed across the water. "This harbor is surrounded." The first battle for Hampton Harbor was about to begin, and Michael Sullivan, the quiet fisherman who had seen it all before, was right in the middle of it. The fight for Hampton Harbor began with the screech of tires and gunfire. DEA teams emerged from hidden positions while Ghost's operation scrambled to respond. The Russian, still held at knife point by Sullivan, watched his careful plans dissolve into chaos. "Federal agents, weapons down." Carter's voice carried across the water as tactical teams moved in. Ghost's training showed in his immediate response. Hand signals coordinated his men into defensive positions while the suspicious fishing vessels suddenly changed course, attempting to scatter. "They're running for international waters," Sullivan observed, maintaining control of the Russian. But they forgot something important about Hampton Harbor. 3 Coast Guard cutters appeared on the horizon, their timing perfect. They'd been waiting just out of sight, guided by Sullivan and Carter's careful planning. "You think this stops anything?" The Russian snarled. "We have people everywhere, ports up and down the coast." "That's exactly what we're counting on," Sullivan replied calmly. "Ghost's operation just exposed your entire network." The firefight was brief but intense. Ghost's men showed their military training, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The DEA had been preparing this raid for weeks, using Sullivan's confrontation as the perfect trigger. Sarah watched from her market security room as corrupt Officer Reynolds tried to interfere, only to find himself surrounded by federal agents who'd been posing as tourists. Tom's cameras caught everything: the weapons, the coordinated response, the attempted escape. The cigarette boat made a desperate run for open water, but Coast Guard interceptors were faster. Ghost himself tried to reach his SUV, but found his path blocked by Carter's tactical team. "It's over, Ghost," Sullivan called out, having secured the Russian. "Your entire operation is exposed." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Ghost shouted back. "This goes higher than you know. We're just one piece." "Oh, we understand perfectly," Carter responded, approaching with his weapon drawn. "That's why we let you set up here. Hampton Harbor was the perfect trap." As federal agents secured the scene, Sullivan noticed something in Ghost's reaction, not fear of arrest, but concern about something else. The veteran's instincts that had kept him alive through 3 wars told him this was just the beginning. Tom approached with his tablet, showing surveillance footage. "Look at these radio communications we intercepted. They were reporting to someone else, someone not here." "Ghost is middle management," Sullivan concluded, "running the operation but not controlling it. Someone bigger is pulling the strings." Sarah joined them, watching as agents began searching the suspicious fishing vessels. "Will they talk? Ghost and his men?" "Some will," Carter said. "The younger ones, the ones Ghost recruited. But the core group, they're too professional," Sullivan finished. "Too well trained. This isn't over." The morning sun climbed higher as Hampton Harbor transformed into a federal crime scene. Evidence teams discovered hidden compartments in the fishing vessels, weapons caches in the Demon's Path bikes, and detailed records of smuggling operations. "Found something interesting," Carter called out, holding up documents from Ghost's SUV. "Plans for other harbors, shipping schedules, military-grade communication equipment. This was just one node in a larger network." Sullivan studied the gathered evidence, his military intelligence training recognizing patterns. They're using veterans' knowledge of coastal operations, turning their training against the system. Question is, who's organizing it all? The day's events had exposed one layer of corruption, but Sullivan knew from experience that criminal enterprises this sophisticated always had deeper roots. Ghost's operation was dismantled, but somewhere, someone was already planning their next move. As federal agents led Ghost and his men away in handcuffs, Sullivan touched his silver star pin, remembering other victories that had turned out to be just the beginning of longer wars. Hampton Harbor was secure for now, but the real battle was just starting. Back at the harbor office, Sullivan, Carter, and Tom analyzed the intelligence gathered from the raid. Documents and hard drives revealed an operation far more extensive than they'd initially suspected. "Look at these shipping manifests," Carter said, spreading papers across Tom's desk. "Weapons moving through a dozen harbors coordinated with military precision. Ghost's operation here was just one piece." Sullivan studied surveillance photos from other ports. Same pattern everywhere. Veterans recruited for muscle, corrupt officials for cover, legitimate fishing operations compromised. "This came from Ghost's phone," Tom added, displaying encrypted messages on his screen. "They report to someone called the Admiral," military background based on the communication protocols. Sarah entered with urgent news. "Just heard from other fish markets up the coast. More Demon's Path chapters showing up at their harbors using the same tactics. They're not shutting down," Sullivan realized. "They're adapting, shifting operations, which means—" "The Admiral's changing strategies," Carter finished. "Ghost's arrest exposed part of the network but didn't touch the leadership. A Coast Guard report came in. 3 suspicious vessels spotted near Portland Harbor, using the same profile as the boats they'd intercepted. Found something else, Tom said, enhancing security footage. Look at Ghost's last radio transmission before the raid. He wasn't calling for backup, he was warning someone. The footage showed Ghost's urgent hand signals, military code that Sullivan recognized. He was signaling command compromise, protect primary asset. The weapons weren't their main cargo. Carter's phone buzzed with updates from other DEA teams. Similar operations discovered in 5 more harbors, all using veteran-run motorcycle gangs as cover, all reporting to this admiral. Sullivan mapped the locations, a pattern emerging. They're not random. These harbors form a strategic network. Someone's building a private navy, using veterans who know coastal operations. "Mike," Sarah called from the window, "that fishing boat that got away during the raid? It's back, watching us from beyond the harbor limits." Through binoculars, Sullivan observed the vessel. Not watching, signaling. Look at their light pattern. Tom enhanced his camera feed, capturing the boat's seemingly random light flashes. Military code? Navy special warfare signals, Sullivan confirmed. They're letting us know we're being watched. The Admiral's sending a message. Carter received another urgent update. Ghost is talking. Says the Admiral is planning something big. Multiple harbors. Coordinated operation. But he claims not to know the details. He knows, Sullivan said. Ghost's too well trained to be just a pawn. The Admiral's operation has layers. Fishing boats for transport, bikers for muscle, corrupt officials for cover. But what's the real objective? Sarah reported more Demon's Path bikers seen in neighboring towns. They're regrouping, changing tactics. The Admiral's adapting, Sullivan explained. Ghost's arrest was anticipated, planned for. This whole network is designed to survive exposure. Tom's surveillance system flagged unusual activity. Multiple boats requesting berths, all with similar profiles to the smuggling vessels we caught. They're testing our response, Carter said, probing for weaknesses. Sullivan studied the harbor's layout, remembering similar patterns from his military days. The Admiral's not just running weapons, he's establishing control points along the coast. Each harbor is a strategic position. As night fell over Hampton Harbor, the team realized they'd uncovered something far more dangerous than a smuggling operation. Someone with military expertise was building a sophisticated network, using veteran skills and knowledge to create something unprecedented. We need to find the Admiral, Carter stated, gathering evidence. No, Sullivan corrected, touching his silver star. We need to let the Admiral find us. Sometimes the best way to expose a covert operation is to become a threat they can't ignore. The harbor lights reflected off the water, but somewhere in the darkness, plans were being made. The quiet fisherman who had started this investigation knew the next move would be crucial and potentially deadly. The next morning brought a new phase to Hampton Harbor. 3 black SUVs arrived before dawn, carrying what appeared to be more Demon's Path members. But Sullivan recognized their movement patterns. These were military operators, not bikers. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, Carter observed from their surveillance position in Sarah's market. Direct show of force. The newcomers established positions around the harbor, their tactics revealing advanced training. Their leader, a man Sullivan's age with a captain's bearing, approached the Sea Ghost. Commander Marcus Drake, he announced. Though you probably knew me as Shark in the Persian Gulf, Sullivan. Naval Special Warfare, Sullivan replied. Heard you went private after the war. Didn't expect to find you running errands for the Admiral. Drake smiled coldly. Times change. The Admiral understands what you seem to have forgotten. Men like us, we're meant for more than fishing and following rules. Sarah watched nervously as more operators took strategic positions. Tom's cameras caught their sophisticated equipment, military-grade weapons poorly concealed under civilian clothes. Ghost's operation was sloppy, Drake continued. Too obvious. The Admiral sent me to clean things up. Clean up or eliminate witnesses, Sullivan asked. Depends on you, old friend. The Admiral respects your skills, offers a place in the organization. Better than playing fisherman while the world passes you by. Sullivan noted the positioned snipers, the blocked escape routes. Still using the same tactical setup from Gulf operations. Some things don't change. Last chance, Sullivan. The Admiral's operation is bigger than you know. Global reach, military precision, unlimited resources. That's the problem with you and the Admiral, Sullivan replied. Still fighting the last war, using old tactics. But you forgot the first rule of coastal operations. And what's that? Drake asked, his hand moving subtly toward his weapon. Always check the tide charts. On cue, Coast Guard sirens blared. The morning fog lifted to reveal 3 cutters that had slipped in during low tide, using the harbor's natural channels to avoid detection. Federal agents! Carter's voice boomed as DEA teams emerged from hidden positions. Drop your weapons! Drake's tactical response was immediate, but Sullivan had anticipated it. The Sea Ghost's deck erupted in smoke, military-grade screening devices Sullivan had planted earlier. You're not the only one who remembers Gulf tactics, Sullivan said, moving through the chaos with practiced ease. The firefight was brief but intense. Drake's men were professionals, but they were caught in a carefully planned crossfire. Tom's cameras captured everything while Sarah coordinated with local authorities. The Admiral won't stop, Drake warned as agents secured him. This is bigger than harbors and smuggling. We're building something important. You're building a criminal empire, Sullivan corrected, using veterans as pawns. That's not important. That's tragic. The morning's operation yielded more than arrests. Drake's phones contained encrypted communications, his vehicles held detailed operational plans, and his men's equipment revealed military supply chains that shouldn't exist. Found something interesting, Carter said afterward. Drake's orders came directly from the Admiral. First confirmation of direct command structure. Sullivan studied the evidence, seeing patterns emerge. The Admiral's building more than a smuggling network. These are military-style staging areas disguised as harbors. Question is, staging for what? As federal teams processed the scene, Sullivan knew they just escalated the conflict. The Admiral would respond, and next time it wouldn't be through intermediaries. The quiet fisherman touched his silver star, remembering other battles that had started small and grown into wars. Sometimes victory wasn't about winning the fight. It was about surviving long enough to expose the truth. The discovery of Drake's operation brought unexpected revelations. While processing evidence, Carter found detailed plans revealing coordination between multiple harbors, all reporting to centralized command. Look at this, Carter said, spreading maritime charts across Sullivan's deck. Every compromised harbor is positioned near military installations or major shipping lanes. Sullivan studied the patterns. The Admiral's creating a shadow fleet, using legitimate fishing vessels as cover for something bigger. Sarah rushed down the pier. Just got word from my contacts up north. 3 fishing boats disappeared after making routine runs. Crews all veterans recently recruited by unknown parties. They're not disappearing, Sullivan realized. They're being absorbed into the Admiral's operation. Tom's surveillance system flagged unusual movement. A flotilla of fishing vessels was approaching, their formation too precise to be coincidental. Multiple contacts, Tom radioed. They're running dark, using military protocols to avoid standard detection. Through his binoculars, Sullivan observed their approach. Those aren't fishing boats anymore. Look at the modifications, hidden weapon mounts, reinforced hulls, tactical communication arrays. The Admiral's making his move, Carter concluded, demonstrating force. The lead vessel's captain hailed the harbor. His voice carried military authority. This is Commander Richards. Harbor is now under temporary maritime security protocols. All civilian vessels will submit to inspection. Sullivan recognized the tactic. They're not here to fight. They're here to establish control, show everyone who really owns these waters. Sarah reported more vessels approaching from the south. They're boxing us in, creating a blockade. Classic naval special warfare strategy, Sullivan explained. Control the water, you control everything else. Tom's cameras caught strange activities on the incoming boats, crews moving with military precision, equipment that had no place on fishing vessels. Found something in Drake's files, Carter said urgently. The Admiral's real identity, Vice Admiral James Morrison, former Naval Special Operations Commander. Sullivan's expression hardened. Morrison should have known. He always talked about creating a private maritime force, said the regular Navy was too restricted by rules. You knew him? Worked with him in the Gulf. Brilliant tactician, but dangerous ideas. Believed in absolute control of strategic waterways, whatever the cost. The flotilla continued its approach, their formation creating an increasingly tight perimeter around Hampton Harbor. They're not just showing force, Sullivan observed. This is a message. Morrison's telling us he can shut down any harbor, any time. Carter received urgent updates from other ports. Similar vessels were appearing coastwide, all coordinating with military precision. Morrison's built more than a smuggling operation, Sullivan concluded. He's created a private navy, using veterans who know how to control coastal waters, and now he's showing us exactly what he can do with it. The quiet harbor had become center stage in a power play that stretched across the entire coastline. As the sun set, Sullivan knew they'd finally identified their real enemy and understood the true scale of what they were fighting. Morrison won't stop with displays of force, Sullivan warned. This is just the beginning. He's building something bigger than any of us imagined. The waters of Hampton Harbor reflected the gathering darkness, but somewhere out there, a former admiral was moving pieces into position for a confrontation that would reshape the entire coast. The next morning, Vice Admiral Morrison made his first direct move. A sleek yacht entered Hampton Harbor, its crew displaying the same military precision as the blockading vessels. Morrison himself stood on deck, his naval bearing unchanged by years in the private sector. Like old times, Sullivan, Morrison called out. You're still fighting battles that should have ended years ago. Sullivan watched from the Sea Ghost as Morrison's yacht docked. Some battles need fighting, Admiral, especially when someone's turning veterans into criminals. Criminals? Morrison laughed. I'm giving them purpose. Structure, the same things they had in service. Sarah and Tom monitored from the market's security room as Morrison's security teams deployed across the pier. Carter maintained radio contact with Coast Guard units standing by outside the harbor. Look around, Morrison gestured to the controlled harbor. Perfect organization, military precision. I'm building something extraordinary here. You're building an illegal private navy, Sullivan countered, using veterans to control coastal waters for criminal enterprises. Morrison approached the Sea Ghost, his escort maintaining tactical positions. The world's changing, Sullivan. Governments are weak. Borders mean nothing. Real power lies in controlling the waterways. By corrupting everything we fought for? By creating order. These harbors, these veterans, they're wasted following civilian rules. I'm giving them a greater purpose. Sullivan noted Morrison's hand signals to his men, recognizing preparations for a tactical operation. Purpose or control? Both, Morrison smiled. Ghost's operation was crude, Drake's was better, but this... He gestured to the blockading fleet. This is just the beginning. The harbor had grown silent, commercial traffic frozen by Morrison's display of force. His veterans-turned-soldiers held key positions throughout the area. Last chance, old friend, Morrison offered. Join us. Help build something meaningful instead of clinging to outdated loyalties. Like your loyalty to the oath we took, Sullivan challenged. The one about defending against all enemies, foreign and domestic? Morrison's expression hardened. That oath belongs to a dying system. I'm creating something new, something powerful. You're creating terrorists, Sullivan said quietly. Taking good men and turning them into criminals. That's not power. That's corruption. Terrorists? Morrison laughed. I prefer to think of them as privatized maritime security, the new face of coastal control. Sarah's voice came urgently through Sullivan's hidden earpiece. Multiple boats approaching from the east, heavy weapons visible. Your fleet's impressive, Sullivan acknowledged. But you forgot something important about Hampton Harbor. And what's that? It's attracted attention, the kind that doesn't show up on radar. On cue, 3 Coast Guard cutters emerged from the morning fog, accompanied by DEA vessels. Carter's voice boomed across the water. This is a federal operation. All vessels stand down. Morrison's smile didn't waver. You think I didn't plan for this? Every boat out there has former military crew, veterans who understand real loyalty. No, Sullivan corrected. Veterans you've manipulated, men who've forgotten what that uniform really meant. The confrontation had reached its tipping point. Morrison's private navy versus federal forces, with Hampton Harbor caught in the middle. The next move would determine whether one old fisherman's stand against corruption would end in victory or tragedy. The confrontation at Hampton Harbor reached its climax as Morrison's forces faced off against federal authorities. Sullivan watched from the Sea Ghost as tensions escalated, knowing the next few minutes would determine everything. Impressive show of force, Morrison commented, eyeing the Coast Guard cutters. But my men are better trained, better equipped, and absolutely loyal. Loyal to what? Sullivan challenged. Money? Power? Or did you convince them they're still serving something greater? Morrison's flotilla maintained perfect formation, weapons visible, but not yet raised. The morning fog created an eerie backdrop to the standoff. Each of those boats, Morrison gestured, is crewed by veterans I saved from civilian mediocrity, men who were wasting away in normal jobs until I gave them back their purpose. You mean men you corrupted, Sullivan corrected. Turned them from warriors into criminals. Sarah's voice came through Sullivan's earpiece. More vessels approaching from the south. They're running military formation. Your federal friends are outmatched, Morrison smiled. Every captain out there is former naval special warfare. They know exactly what they're doing. But Sullivan had noticed something Morrison hadn't. Subtle movements among the blockading vessels. Not all of Morrison's loyal crews looked comfortable with their current situation. Tell me, Admiral, Sullivan said carefully, how many of your men know they're part of a criminal enterprise? How many think they're working legitimate maritime security? The question hit home. Several of Morrison's nearby crews shifted uneasily. They know they're part of something important, Morrison snapped. Something bigger than arbitrary laws and civilian restrictions. Carter's voice carried across the water. This is your final warning. All vessels will power down and prepare for boarding. Morrison raised his radio, ready to give the order that would start a war. But Sullivan played his final card. Before you give that order, he called out, you should know. Tom's cameras have been broadcasting everything. Every word, every threat, every admission of criminal intent, live streamed to multiple federal agencies. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Check your phone, Sullivan suggested. I'm sure your intelligence people are trying to contact you right now. Morrison's phone was indeed buzzing. His face darkened as he read incoming messages. Those men out there, Sullivan continued, loud enough for nearby crews to hear. They joined you thinking they were serving a cause. Now they know they're just pawns in a criminal operation. How many will still follow your orders? The first defection came from Morrison's portside vessel. Its captain cut engines, raised hands, then another boat, and another. Stand firm, Morrison commanded, but his authority was crumbling. Sullivan addressed the harbor. Any vessel that stands down now will be treated as cooperating. This is your chance to remember what that uniform really meant. The blockade began dissolving as more crews chose surrender over criminal conspiracy. Morrison watched his private navy collapse, his perfect military precision falling apart. It's over, Admiral, Sullivan said quietly. Time to surrender with whatever honor you have left. Morrison's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sullivan was faster. Years of combat training took over as he subdued his former superior officer. You forgot the most important lesson of command, Sullivan said, securing Morrison. True loyalty can't be bought. It has to be earned. As federal agents swarmed the harbor, Sullivan watched Morrison's criminal empire crumble. The quiet fisherman's stand against corruption had exposed a conspiracy that stretched across the coast and given countless veterans a chance to reclaim their honor. The aftermath of Morrison's arrest transformed Hampton Harbor. Federal agents processed dozens of surrendered vessels, while Coast Guard teams secured the waterfront. Sullivan watched from the Sea Ghost as Morrison's criminal empire was dismantled piece by piece. Final count, Carter reported, joining Sullivan. 38 vessels seized, over 200 veterans in custody, and enough evidence to expose similar operations in harbors across 3 countries. Sarah brought coffee as they observed the cleanup. Many of the younger veterans are cooperating. Most had no idea they were part of a criminal enterprise. Morrison's files are a goldmine, Tom added, reviewing data from seized computers. Detailed records of every operation, every corrupt official, every compromised harbor. Sullivan noticed something in the patterns of surrendered crews. Look at their positions, their reactions when Morrison was arrested. The outer vessels surrendered first. The ones furthest from his direct influence, Carter understood. They were less indoctrinated. They were the newest recruits, Sullivan explained. Still remembered their real training, their true purpose. Morrison's control wasn't complete. A group of former crew members approached the Sea Ghost, led by a young captain. "Sir," he addressed Sullivan, "we want to help make this right. Many of us. We thought we were doing legitimate security work." Sullivan nodded. That's exactly what Morrison counted on. Using your training, your desire to serve, turning it against you. Carter received updates from other ports. Similar surrenders happening coastwide. Morrison's arrest triggered a cascade effect. His whole network is unraveling. "Found something else," Tom reported. International connections. Morrison wasn't just building a private navy. He was selling his model to other organizations. The real damage, Sullivan said quietly, wasn't the smuggling or the corruption. It was taking good men, trained veterans, and turning them into criminals. That's what we need to fix. Sarah watched as more crews came forward, seeking redemption. Can they come back from this? Make it right? They already are, Sullivan replied, touching his silver star. By choosing to stand down, to expose the truth, they're remembering who they really are. Coast Guard teams continued securing vessels while federal agents gathered evidence. But the real work, Sullivan knew, was just beginning, helping lost veterans find their way back to honor. The morning sun broke through the fog, illuminating a harbor transformed. Where Morrison had sought to build an empire of corruption, something else was emerging, a chance for redemption, for veterans to reclaim their true purpose. 1 month after Morrison's arrest, Hampton Harbor hosted a different kind of gathering. Veterans from across the coast came together, not as part of a criminal enterprise, but as men seeking redemption. Final numbers are in, Carter shared with Sullivan. 312 veterans in rehabilitation programs, over $500 million in seized assets, and evidence leading to arrests in 11 countries. Sullivan watched as former crew members helped Coast Guard teams catalog seized vessels. The boats that once formed Morrison's private navy were being converted back to legitimate use. The reach was bigger than we thought, Tom reported, reviewing the last data dumps. Morrison had connections to international arms dealers, terrorist organizations, and corrupt military contractors. Sarah organized support services for affected families. Many of these men were manipulated when they were vulnerable. Lost jobs, PTSD, feeling abandoned by the system. That's what Morrison exploited, Sullivan explained. He offered them purpose when they needed it most, turned their skills against them. The harbor had become a symbol of transformation. Where Morrison once demonstrated power through force, now showed strength through redemption. Former crews worked alongside federal agents, helping to dismantle the very network they once served. Most important discovery wasn't the weapons or the smuggling routes, Carter noted. It was Morrison's recruitment playbook. Now we know how to spot similar operations, prevent it from happening again. A young veteran approached Sullivan. "Sir, we've started a support group, helping others who were drawn into operations like this, showing them there's a way back." Sullivan nodded, touching his silver star. That's the real victory. Not just stopping Morrison, but helping his victims remember who they really are. The water reflected the morning sun as more boats arrived, not for criminal operations, but bringing veterans seeking help. Hampton Harbor had become more than a battleground. It was now a place of healing where lost warriors could find their way home. Morrison thought he was building an empire, Sullivan reflected. Instead, he showed us exactly what we needed to fix. Sometimes the biggest threats aren't the enemies we can see. They're the ones who try to turn good men against themselves. The quiet fisherman's stand against corruption had evolved into something larger, a movement to protect veterans from those who would exploit their training, their loyalty, and their need to serve. The battle for Hampton Harbor was over, but the mission to safeguard those who served had just begun. The final cleanup of Morrison's operation revealed deeper implications. As federal teams processed the last evidence, patterns emerged that would reshape coastal security. "We've identified similar operations forming in other regions," Carter explained to Sullivan on the Sea Ghost's deck. "Groups targeting veterans offering the same promises Morrison did." Sullivan studied new intelligence reports. They're copying his playbook: military precision, veteran recruitment, legitimate businesses as cover. Sarah brought urgent news from her maritime network. 3 more harbors reported suspicious recruitment attempts. They're using Morrison's tactics, but learning from his mistakes. "More subtle now," Tom noted, showing surveillance data. "Smaller groups, better compartmentalization, making it harder to spot the patterns." A Coast Guard captain joined their meeting. "Sir, we've implemented the detection protocols you developed. Already flagged 2 potential operations on the West Coast." Morrison's arrest exposed the method, Sullivan explained, but also created a vacuum. Others will try to fill it. The harbor had become a training center, teaching federal agencies how to identify and prevent veteran exploitation. Sullivan's experience proved invaluable in developing new security protocols. "Most significant change," Carter observed, "is in veteran support services. We're not just stopping these operations, we're preventing them from starting." Sullivan watched as another group of former crew members completed their rehabilitation program. "That's the real victory, breaking the cycle of exploitation before it begins." The quiet fisherman's stand had evolved into a nationwide initiative. Hampton Harbor now hosted regular training sessions for law enforcement and veteran support groups, teaching them to recognize and counter manipulation attempts. Morrison thought he was building something unstoppable, Sullivan reflected, touching his silver star. Instead, he showed us exactly how to stop others from following his path. The morning fog lifted, revealing a harbor transformed. Where once corruption threatened to control the coast, now stood a beacon of hope and redemption. The battle that began with one veteran's refusal to back down had become a movement to protect those who served, ensuring that never again would their dedication be turned against them. A year after Morrison's operation was dismantled, Hampton Harbor had become something entirely different. Sullivan stood on the Sea Ghost's deck, watching the sunrise over waters that once hosted criminal enterprises but now symbolized redemption. Latest report from the Veteran Support Network, Sarah shared. Over 800 former operatives rehabilitated, most now helping identify and prevent similar recruitment attempts. Tom managed the harbor's new security training center, where federal agents learned to spot signs of veteran exploitation. 3 more operations prevented last month alone. Morrison's tactics are becoming easier to recognize. "The pattern's changing," Carter noted, joining them with fresh intelligence. "Criminal organizations are avoiding veteran recruitment. Our success here made them too risky as targets." Sullivan observed a group of former crew members leading a Coast Guard training exercise. Their military precision, once used for illegal operations, now served to protect the waters they'd once exploited. "Found something interesting in the latest data," Tom reported. "Other harbors are implementing our model, creating support networks, early warning systems, veteran outreach programs." "That's the real legacy," Sullivan said, touching his silver star. "Not just stopping Morrison, but creating a system to prevent others from following his example." Hampton Harbor had transformed from a battleground to a blueprint. Law enforcement agencies worldwide studied their methods, learning how to protect veterans from exploitation while helping those already affected find redemption. "Remember that first morning?" Sarah asked. "When it all started with those bikers?" Sullivan smiled slightly. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands. One quiet harbor showing that corruption can be fought, that veterans can be protected." The water reflected the morning sun, as boats headed out for their daily catch. But now each vessel carried crew members trained to spot suspicious activity, to recognize manipulation attempts, to protect their fellow veterans. Morrison thought he was creating an unstoppable force, Carter reflected. Instead, he showed us exactly what we needed to build, a network of protection instead of exploitation. The quiet fisherman's stand against corruption had evolved into something permanent, a system to ensure that veterans' skills and loyalty would never again be turned against them. The battle for Hampton Harbor was over, but its impact would continue to protect those who served for generations to come. The final chapter of Hampton Harbor's transformation revealed its lasting impact. 5 years after Morrison's arrest, Sullivan watched a new generation of maritime security teams training in the waters where corruption once ruled. Global Impact Assessment, Carter presented. Veteran exploitation in maritime operations down 87%. 20 countries have adopted our protection protocols. Over 2,000 veterans saved from similar schemes. Sullivan's quiet stand had created ripples across the world's harbors. Where Morrison sought to build criminal empires, now stood networks of protection and support. The training centers expanded again, Sarah reported. We're now hosting international law enforcement, teaching them to spot exploitation patterns before they take root. Tom managed the harbor's sophisticated early warning system, a model replicated in ports worldwide. Latest AI analysis shows potential threats down 92% in protected harbors. The Morrison playbook is effectively obsolete. Hampton Harbor had become more than a success story. It was a blueprint for protecting veterans globally. Each day, boats sailed under the watchful eye of crews trained to recognize and prevent exploitation. Found this in the archives, Carter said, showing Sullivan an old photo of the first confrontation. Hard to believe it all started with one fisherman refusing to back down. Sullivan touched his silver star, remembering. Sometimes the smallest battles lead to the biggest changes. Morrison thought he was building an empire, but he actually showed us how to protect what matters most, the honor and integrity of those who served. The morning sun painted the harbor in golden light, reflecting off waters now safeguarded by the very system that rose from its darkest hour. The legacy of Hampton Harbor wasn't just in stopping one criminal enterprise. It was in creating a worldwide network, ensuring that veterans' skills and loyalty would forever be protected from those who would exploit them. In the end, the quiet fisherman's stand against corruption had become something far greater. A permanent guardian of those who served, a beacon of hope for veterans worldwide, and a reminder that sometimes the most important victories start with one person refusing to look the other way. As Sullivan watched the next generation of protectors training in the harbor, he knew that the real victory wasn't in defeating Morrison. It was in ensuring that his story would never be repeated. Hampton Harbor had become more than a place. It was a promise to all veterans that their honor would always be defended, their service respected, and their future protected. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.